January 1933. Berlin is a clinical study in failure. The vaults are empty. The factories are silent. 6 million Germans are standing in bread lines. The national math is a disaster. But 6 years later, the same nation launches the most sophisticated war machine in human history. 3,000 tanks, 4,000 aircraft, 3 million soldiers. How do you pay for a world-conquering military when you can't even afford a loaf of bread? In the dialect of the 1930s, this was a masterpiece of deception. A financial trick so bold it fooled the world's greatest auditors. It wasn't a miracle. It was a scam. A national-scale Ponzi scheme built on ghost companies and shadow currency. This is the strategic autopsy of the mefo bill, the invisible money that built the Third Reich, and the ticking clock that made World War II an economic necessity. Germany in 1933 was a nation economically destroyed twice in 14 years. First came 1923, the year of the hyperinflation apocalypse. The mark didn't just lose value, it vanished. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. A single US dollar was worth 4 trillion. Workers were paid twice a day. They carried their wages in wheelbarrows. By lunch, their morning pay couldn't buy a postage stamp. The middle class was erased. Pensions vanished. Savings became kindling for stoves. The psychological scar was permanent. The German people learned a cold lesson. They learned that paper money is a lie. Then came 1929, the Great Depression. American banks called in their loans. The German industrial engine stalled. Foreign capital fled. Unemployment exploded. By 1932, 30% of the workforce was in the street. Adolf Hitler inherited a bankrupt estate. The Treaty of Versailles was a tight leash. It was a clinical cage. It limited the army to 100,000 men. No tanks, no planes, no submarines. Hitler wanted a total rearmament. He wanted it immediately. And he wanted it in secret. But he had a problem. If he printed money, inflation would return. The wheelbarrows would come back. The public would revolt. If he borrowed money openly, the Allies would see the debt. The British and French auditors would intervene. He needed a wizard. He needed a man who could speak the dialect of the markets. He needed a man who could hide the math of a criminal. He found Hjalmar Schacht. Schacht was the wizard of German finance. He had already saved the currency once in 1923. He was a hero of the establishment. In March 1933, Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank. Schacht was a nationalist. He loathed Versailles. He wanted a strong Germany. But he was also a master of the ledger. He knew the Reich was broke. Hitler gave him a simple mandate. Find the money, hide the spending, rearm the nation. Schacht knew he couldn't use the official budget. He had to create a shadow system. He needed money that didn't exist on any balance sheet. He sat in his office at the Reichsbank and drafted the blueprint for the greatest financial deception of the 20th century. The trick was about to begin. Hjalmar Schacht was the predator of the ledger. He was the wizard of German finance. He did not wear a brown shirt. He wore high, stiff collars. He wore steel-rimmed glasses. He carried the aura of a man who owned the room. By 1933, his reputation was legendary. He was the man who had performed the ultimate surgical rescue of the German mark in 1923. When the currency was worthless, Schacht stabilized it. He created the written mark. He proved he could invent value where none existed. He was a hero to the establishment. He was a professional in a room full of fanatics. On March 17, 1933, Adolf Hitler appointed him president of the Reichsbank. A year later, he was the Minister of Economics. Schacht was a nationalist. He loathed the chains of the Versailles Treaty. He wanted to see Germany restored to its clinical peak. But he was also a master of the arithmetic. He knew the state of the books. The Reich was not just broke, it was a vacuum. Hitler's demand was absolute: rearmament at any cost. The military needed tanks, planes, and ships. They needed them in the thousands. But the treasury was empty. The gold reserves were a joke. By 1934, Germany's gold coverage for its currency had dropped to less than 1%. Germany was an industrial giant with no wallet. The challenge was a technical paradox. If Schacht simply printed marks to pay for the steel, inflation would explode. The 1923 nightmare was a fresh scar. The German people would not tolerate wheelbarrows of cash again. If he borrowed the money through official government bonds, the debt would be public. Foreign attachés in Berlin watched every official statement. British and French auditors tracked the Reich's spending. Any spike in military debt would trigger an international crisis. The Allies would shut down the German economy. They would do it before the first Messerschmitt took flight. Schacht needed a way to borrow billions in total silence. He needed a financial shadow. He was the wizard because he understood the difference between money and credit. Money is what you have. Credit is what others think you have. Schacht realized he could build a war machine on credit, provided the world didn't see the receipt. He began to design a system that would bypass the state budget entirely. It was a surgical act of off-balance sheet architecture. He needed to create a buffer, a private-looking entity that could sign IOUs. These IOUs needed to be as good as cash, but invisible to the public record. They needed the prestige of industry. They needed the authority of the central bank. But they had to be disconnected from the government's official debt. Schacht was the only man with the prestige to pull it off. He gave the Nazi regime a premium mask for the international markets. He convinced the bankers. He calmed the industrialists. He sat in the Reichsbank and drafted the blueprints for a ghost. The ghost would pay for the panzers. This ghost would fund the Luftwaffe. It was a shell company with no employees and an infinite credit line. The name of the ghost was MEFO. It was the greatest financial sleight of hand in human history. Schacht had found the loophole. He was about to build a global superpower with a ghost's signature. The arithmetic of war was about to begin. Hjalmar Schacht did not start by building factories. He started by building a legal fiction. He needed a puppet to hold the pen. He needed a corporate entity that was legally distinct from the German state. It had to be a bridge between the Reich's empty treasury and the furnaces of the industrial titans. In May 1934, Schacht performed a clinical act of corporate creation. He founded the Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft, MBH. In the dialect of the 1930s, this was shortened to MEFO. On a standard government audit, it looked like a harmless research consortium. Its name, the Metallurgical Research Company, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic boredom. It suggested labs, test tubes, and academic white papers. But the board of directors did not consist of scientists. It consisted of the masters of the German industrial complex. Schacht selected 4 shareholders to provide the clinical mask of legitimacy: Siemens, Krupp, Rheinmetall, Güterhofungsviertel. These were the blue-chip names of European industry. Their involvement was the strategic anchor of the entire scheme. If a foreign bank or a French attaché looked at the registry, they didn't see a government front. They saw a private collaboration between Germany's most prestigious companies. The involvement of Krupp and Siemens signaled stability. It suggested a private venture into innovation. But look closer at the arithmetic. The total capital of MEFO was a mere 1 million marks. For a company that was about to fund the largest rearmament in human history, this was a joke. In the world of high finance, 1 million marks was a rounding error. It was pocket change. This tiny capitalization was a deliberate strategy. It made MEFO look small. It made it look irrelevant. In reality, MEFO did no research. It had no laboratories. It had no scientists. It produced no patents. It was a hollow shell, a mailbox with a billion-mark destiny. The company existed for one reason: to act as the primary debtor. By using a private company as the middleman, Schacht created a strategic void in the national ledger. Under the laws of the time, the debts of a private company did not have to be reported in the official state budget. This was the ultimate off-balance sheet vehicle. When the Ministry of Defense ordered a new fleet of Panzers, they didn't pay for them with state funds. They ordered them through MEFO. When the Luftwaffe needed a secret hangar built, the contract wasn't signed by the government. It was signed by the ghost. This created a clean balance sheet for the German Reich. Foreign observers saw a government that was living within its means. They saw a balanced budget. They saw a nation recovering from the Great Depression through public works and the Autobahn. They did not see the 12 billion marks in hidden credit. The Allied auditors were looking for government spending. They were tracking the state's official liabilities. They were not looking at the private business transactions of a metallurgical firm in Berlin. Schacht had built a machine that could generate credit without the borrowing ever being recorded by the public. He had created a system where the government could borrow billions from its own people without ever asking for a formal loan. The board at MEFO met in clinical silence. There were no public shareholders. There were no annual reports. There was only the ghost and the pen. But a shell company is just a vehicle. To move, it needs fuel. It needs a currency that banks will accept, even if the government won't officially back it. Schacht didn't use the mark. He invented a piece of paper that was legally a promise, but practically a banknote. The shadow currency of the Third Reich was ready. The industrial engine of Germany was about to wake up, and it was going to be paid in a new dialect of debt. The MEFO bill was about to change the world. The first transaction was already being drafted. The paper trail was about to begin, hidden in plain sight, deep within the vaults of the German industrial giants. Schacht had built the ghost. Now he was about to give it the power of a god. Hjalmar Schacht had the company. Now he needed the paper. He didn't want to print Reichsmarks. Printing marks was the old dialect of disaster. It led to bread lines and wheelbarrows. Schacht wanted to print a promise. He invented the MEFO bill. In the world of high finance, a bill of exchange is a standard tool. It is a promissory note. It is one company telling another, "I will pay you in 6 months." Schacht took this boring business instrument and weaponized it. Imagine you are a director at Krupp. You just signed a contract for 500 Panzer hulls. Usually, the government would pay you in cash, but the treasury is empty. Instead, the government hands you a MEFO bill. It is a slip of paper. It is issued by the shell company, MEFO. It is not signed by the German state. It is signed by a ghost. The bill has a term of 6 months. But Schacht added a clinical twist. These bills could be extended again and again. The term could be stretched for up to 5 years. Krupp cannot pay its workers with a 5-year promise. They need liquidity. Krupp takes the MEFO bill to a private German bank. The bank looks at the paper. They see the name Metallurgische Forschungsgesellschaft. They know this is a show, but they also know the secret arithmetic. Schacht had given a verbal guarantee to the banking sector. The Reichsbank, the central bank, would always be ready to cash these bills. The private bank accepts the bill. They give Krupp real marks. Krupp is satisfied. They have the capital to run the furnaces. The private bank now holds the bill. They could cash it at the Reichsbank immediately, but Schacht offered a premium incentive. He set the interest rate at 4%. In a world still reeling from the Depression, 4% was a surgical strike of profit. It was a high-yield asset. The banks decided to keep the bills. They treated them like gold. They traded them among themselves. The mefo bill became a shadow currency. It was a secret dialect of money spoken only by the elite. It never touched the hands of the German public. It never entered the consumer market. Because it stayed within the industrial loop, it didn't drive up the price of milk or bread. It didn't trigger the 1923-style inflation. It was a closed-circuit economy. By 1938, there were 12 billion marks of this paper circulating in the shadows. For the Reich, this was a miracle of off-balance sheet accounting. Technically, the government didn't owe any money. The debt belonged to mefo. The official debt of Germany looked stable. It looked clean. But in reality, Schacht had built a mountain of secret obligations. He had doubled the national debt without a single headline. The war machine was now self-funding, but every promissory note has a cold reality. The extensions had a limit. 5 years was the maximum. The clock was already ticking. The bills issued in 1934 would come due in 1939. Until then, the deception was absolute. The world was watching a recovery, but they were actually watching a countdown. The silent rearmament was moving into high gear. The panzers weren't just being built, they were being hidden in plain sight. Rearmament was a crime hidden in a spreadsheet. Under the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was a clinical war to the Allies. Foreign attachés and military auditors patrolled the Reich. They were looking for the smoke of a forbidden furnace. They were looking for the steel of a forbidden tank. But they were looking at the official records. That was their first mistake. In the dialect of the 1930s, the Reich was a masterpiece of statistical camouflage. In 1935, the government simply stopped publishing its budget. This was a surgical act of silence. By withholding the data, they created a strategic void. The Allied auditors saw the official numbers. They saw a nation spending its limited capital on public works. They saw the Autobahn. They saw schools and hospitals. They did not see the ghost money of the mefo bills flowing into the hangars. Rearmament wasn't just hidden in the books, it was hidden in the design. The early panzers were not called tanks. In the factory files, they were labeled as agricultural tractors. The Luftwaffe was born in the Deutscher Luftsportverband, the German Air Sports Association. To the world, they were flying clubs. They were glider enthusiasts. They were civilians chasing the clouds. In reality, they were a shadow air force. They were practicing the maneuvers of the Blitzkrieg in unpowered planes. When the time came, they would simply swap the gliders for Messerschmitts. The Autobahn was sold to the public as a symbol of modernity. It was the people's highway. To the military planners, it was a logistical artery. It was designed with extra thick concrete to support the weight of heavy artillery. It was built with long, straight stretches to serve as emergency runways. Everything was dual purpose. Everything was a clinical deception. The world watched the 1936 Berlin Olympics. They saw a prosperous, stable nation. They saw an economic miracle. Hjalmar Schacht maintained the premium mask. He attended international conferences. He spoke with the authority of a global banker. He paid the interest on Germany's foreign debts on time. By keeping the international bankers happy, he kept the Allied auditors quiet. If Germany was paying its bills, the world assumed Germany was playing by the rules. But the arithmetic was a ticking bomb. By 1936, military spending accounted for 10% of Germany's total national income. This was 3 times the rate of Britain or France. The Reich was spending money it didn't have to build a machine it wasn't allowed to possess. The silence was the shield, but a shield cannot fuel a tank. Eventually, the shadow currency had to translate into real industrial power. The ghost money had to become a physical threat. The transition from the ledger to the assembly line was about to begin. Germany was no longer just recovering. It was accelerating. The industrial giants were about to collect their payoff. The ghost paper was now becoming heavy metal. By 1936, the mefo bills had performed a surgical transformation of the German landscape. The invisible money was fueling a very visible industrial explosion. In the dialect of power, the Reich was no longer a customer. It was a partner. The titans of industry didn't just accept the shadow currency. They thrived on it. Krupp was no longer manufacturing agricultural tractors. They were forging the Panzer II. Siemens was building the sophisticated radio networks that would later coordinate the Blitzkrieg. IG Farben, the chemical colossus, was tasked with a miracle of its own. Germany had no natural oil. It had no natural rubber. These were the clinical weaknesses of any modern army. Through mefo funding, IG Farben developed synthetic fuel from coal and synthetic rubber known as Buna. These processes were obscenely expensive. In a normal economy, they would have been a financial suicide. But with Schacht's credit line, cost was an abstraction. The Reich was buying a self-sufficient future with paper that didn't exist. The labor market was the most public part of the deception. In 1933, 6 million Germans were standing in line for soup. By 1936, those same 6 million were standing on assembly lines. The economic miracle was presented to the world as a triumph of leadership. In reality, it was a massive, off-balance sheet public works project. It was military Keynesianism on a scale the world had never seen. But there was a cold arithmetic to this miracle. As the factories shifted to guns, the supply of butter began to shrink. The standard of living for the average German didn't rise. It stagnated. Wages were frozen by decree. Unions were abolished. The worker was a cog in a machine that was building tools he could never use. The Volkswagen project was the ultimate clinical distraction. Hitler promised every German a people's car, the KDF wagon, for 5 marks a week. A worker could save for a vehicle. Thousands signed up. Millions of marks flowed into the government vaults. But the cars never came, not for civilians. The factory was built, but it produced the Kubelwagen, the military jeep. The workers' savings were effectively a forced, interest-free loan to the war machine. It was a brilliant act of domestic plunder. Schacht watched the industrial engine accelerate. He saw the panzers rolling out of the hangars. He saw the Luftwaffe testing its wings. But he also saw the red ink. The Reich was consuming resources faster than it could pay for them. It was a billionaire's lifestyle on a beggar's income. The industrial payoff was a masterpiece of steel, but the foundation was a mountain of promissory notes. The 5-year deadline was no longer a distant threat. It was a looming reality. The friction between the banker's math and the dictator's ambition was about to spark. The wizard had built the machine. Now, the machine was demanding more than the wizard could provide. By 1938, the clinical silence was over. The ghost money was starting to manifest as a national crisis. The shadow currency had a hard deadline. The bills issued in 1934 were set to mature in 1939. Schacht looked at the ledger. It was a mountain of 12 billion marks in secret debt. He knew the Reich treasury was still a vacuum. The economy was overheating. Shortages of steel and rubber were no longer technicalities. They were industrial bottlenecks. Foreign exchange reserves were depleted. Germany could not buy the iron ore it needed to keep the furnaces running. Schacht performed his final analysis of the situation. He told Hitler the truth. The credit line was exhausted. If they didn't stop spending, the mark would collapse. The 1923 ghost was back in the room. But Hitler was not listening to a banker. He had moved past the dialect of math. He was speaking the dialect of conquest. Hitler needed a man who didn't care about balance sheets. He turned to Hermann Göring. Göring was appointed to lead the 4-year plan. His directive was surgical: make the economy ready for war by 1940. Göring didn't understand finance. He understood force. He famously stated, "Guns will make us powerful. Butter will only make us fat." The precision of Schacht was replaced by the reckless ambition of the Air Minister. On January 7, 1939, Schacht made his last move. He and the directors of the Reichsbank submitted a memorandum. It was a desperate warning. They stated that the currency was on the edge of a total meltdown. They demanded a balanced budget. They demanded an end to the ghost money. Hitler's response was a clinical act of termination. On January 20, 1939, he fired Schacht as president of the Reichsbank. The wizard was no longer useful. The machine he built had taken over its creator. But the firing of a banker didn't pay the 12 billion marks. The bills were still due. The Reich had two choices: economic suicide or total expansion. The math of the MEFO bill had made war inevitable. The shadow currency was about to be replaced by the currency of blood. To pay for the rearmament of the past, Germany had to steal the future of its neighbors. The audit of the Reich was moving from the bank to the battlefield. War was not just an ideological ambition. It was a clinical economic necessity. By 1939, the Nazi economy was a shark that had to keep swimming to breathe. The MEFO bills were maturing. The ghost money was demanding to be made real. The Reich had two choices: a total internal collapse or a surgical expansion. Hitler chose the latter. The 1938 annexation of Austria, the Anschluss, was the first major asset seizure. It was a raid on a national scale. Austria possessed significant gold reserves in foreign currency. The Reich seized every ounce. This blood transfusion allowed Schacht's successors to pay off pressing international debts. It bought the military another year of fuel and iron ore. Then came Czechoslovakia. The occupation of the Sudetenland and the later 1939 invasion were motivated by industrial arithmetic. Czechoslovakia was a prize. They held the Skoda works. At the time, this was one of the largest and most sophisticated arms factories on the planet. Hitler didn't have to worry about the cost of tanks anymore. He simply stole the factory that produced them. He also managed to seize the Czech gold reserves held in London through a series of banking deceptions that fooled the Bank of England. The Nazi economy had transitioned from a shadow banking system into a parasitic state. It required a constant supply of new hosts. Each conquest provided a temporary reprieve from the maturing MEFO debt. When Poland was invaded in September 1939, it wasn't just about the territory. It was about grain. It was about coal. It was about the resources of an entire nation to feed the German war machine. The ultimate act of financial extortion occurred in France. After the 1940 victory, Germany imposed occupation costs on the French government. The price was a clinical insult: 400 million francs per day. France was forced to pay for its own occupation. This was a massive wealth transfer that kept the German mark stable while the rest of Europe starved. The economic miracle was a masterpiece of deception. It ended in a disaster of reality. The final phase of the Reich's economy was built on the most horrific cost-saving measure in history: slave labor. Industrial giants like Ig Farben, Krupp, and Siemens became inseparable from the camp system. As the war drained the German workforce, the Reich provided millions of forced laborers from occupied territories and concentration camps. This was the ultimate audit of a criminal regime. The ghost money of the 1930s had evolved into the systematic consumption of human lives. The domestic scams were equally clinical. The Volkswagen Project, the people's car, was a total rug pull. 340,000 German workers had paid 275 million marks into a savings scheme. They were promised a vehicle. Not a single civilian car was delivered. The money was simply diverted into the production of the Kubelwagen for the military. The middle class had funded their own soldiers' transport while walking to work. The regime also funded its survival through the systematic looting of Jewish property. Businesses, bank accounts, and art were seized with surgical precision. This Aryanization of the economy provided billions in liquid assets to keep the state functioning. But even the most aggressive theft cannot outrun the math of total war. By 1944, there were no more countries to loot. The Allied bombers were dismantling the industrial engine. The supply chains were severed. The ghost money had finally reached its terminal point. The mefo bills were now worthless slips of paper in a ruined vault. When the Reich collapsed in May 1945, the economy did not just fail, it evaporated. The debts were never paid. The savings were gone. The gold was scattered. The wizard, Hjalmar Schacht, survived the war and the Nuremberg trials. He claimed he was just a banker doing his job, but history has audited his legacy. He didn't just stabilize a currency. He engineered the financial bridge that allowed a bankrupt ideology to set the world on fire. The B-29 we analyzed previously was a bridge to the modern world. The Nazi economy was a bridge to nowhere. It was a strategic autopsy of a nation that tried to replace real value with ghost credit and plunder. The takeaway for the modern observer is the arithmetic of the scam. You can hide debt in shell companies. You can pay your contractors in promissory notes. You can project a premium image of stability to the world. But a ledger always demands a balance. The Reich's projected stability was a mask for a desperate gambler. They used the ghost money of the 1930s to buy the weapons of the 1940s. They thought they could outrun the debt through conquest. They were wrong. Reality eventually performs its own audit. History is the language of those who survived the collapse. If this deep dive into the engineering of Nazi finance was compelling, acknowledge the data by liking this video. Your support is the raw material that keeps this analysis running. Subscribe for more stories of the engineering of power and the math of history. Leave a comment. Could the Nazi regime have survived without Schacht's ghost money? Or was the scam always destined to end in fire? Thank you for watching, and thank you for demanding the whole story.